Welcome to Philosophical Shorts. I'm Dr. Alex Mosley. Now, what are the signs of a rising militarism? Let's start with definitions. Militarism is the policy of threatening or using military force for political ends, and typically those ends are those that a government decrees are useful. The ism attached to the root word military implies a more rigid set of beliefs, a dogma, that are used to support the existence and deployment of military forces for some purpose. And while those beliefs may be wide-ranging in themselves, they all revolve around the function of the military to support and enforce such beliefs. And, in effect, militarism implies that the military is an end in itself, or we could say the highest value or priority for a government. Since militarism implies a set of beliefs, we can also assert that it implies a cultural modality, a way of being and of thinking that seeps into a country as either something that is held for granted in an implicit understanding, or one which finds regular explication through pronunciations and visibility in media, the newspapers, etc. Such are dogmas. They infuse people's minds, and when unchecked or unchallenged, become their own fixed portal or window to the world. And while we may leave people alone to their own non-adaptive and fixed philosophies of the world when they do not affect others' freedoms, political dogma is most dangerous, as it so often spills over into the persecution of non-believers and those who would question authority. Arguably, some cultures, and hence their modern instantiations of governance, are more militaristic than others, and this can be evinced from the amount spent on the military relative to other government programmes, as well as the more difficult to assess relative emphasis on the military for political ends. Of course, some countries have fallen into a militarised form of government in which the soldiers make the political decisions for the rest of the country. Historically, we can point to archetypal Sparta, in which all male citizens were trained to fight and wage war when necessary, and so their archegetai, or kings, were also soldiers. In Roman times, society was militarised to the extent that all civilians were expected to train and fight for Rome when required, and the military periodically asserted its strength to impose its choice for a new emperor. In English history, Oliver Cromwell had his new model army take over the government in Great Britain, including Ireland, that were ruled over by, in effect, a military junta for 11 years. We can turn to example over example in history, but in modern times the militarization of society is epitomised by the increasing leaning into military solutions for international problems, and we see this gaining momentum in the late 19th century, in which broke out in the Great War of 1914 to 18. But the military mindset was neither broken nor exhausted by that calamitous war. Although the Oxford Union at Oxford University in England famously debated and proclaimed that its generation would fight neither for king nor country again, by 1939 it was all too obvious and undeniable that a renewed Germany under Adolf Hitler had been successfully remilitarizing Germany, despite the Versailles Treaty of 1919, which sought to demilitarize the country, and was patently prepared to wage full-out war to secure its borders, regain lost territory, and indeed to impose its militaristic order on the rest of Europe. And most of that debating society joined up when the Second World War broke out. The Second World War produced more death and destruction, and the militarist momentum persisted around the world during the Cold War, pausing temporarily with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, before taking on a new guise in the war against terrorism in the early 2000s, and of course more recently in the reactions to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Militarism and totalitarianism arguably complement one another well. Militarism seeks military solutions to complex problems. It thus presents a narcissistic or single perspective methodology in which alternatives to war are not worth considering, either because they are written off as being ineffective or they are perceived by the military as dishonourable. It is similar to the totalitarian mindset, which insists that there is only one political solution for a society or for the world, and that solution must invoke total control. Totalitarianism implies that alternative political, religious or moral perspectives are rejected out of hand. The totalitarian of whatever political banner, fascist, communist, national socialist, the names and the flag colours may change, believes that there is only one true ideal political state to be upheld against all contenders. Logically, since people and neighbours are bound to disagree and assert some form of reaction or even rebellion against the drift to totalitarianism, the totalitarian regime must inevitably suppress alternative narratives, voices, political parties, and cultures that act to repel or challenge it. In the complexity of human political life, the question of which comes first, which mindset drives the other in particular instances, for example in the rise of militarism and totalitarianism in the early 20th century Germany or Italy, I shall leave to historians. But we can note that totalitarianism certainly necessitates the use of force against people, and sometimes its neighbours, for its rise to power and to sustain that power. Depending on its particular flavour, it may also have a messianic religious drive, or a belief in a millenarian vision of forcing a people towards a utopia, and so may engage in exporting its political control over neighbouring peoples or the entire world. And so, of course, military force would be paramount to its goals. As a contrast, we should consider the non-militaristic state, in which a country may provide ample relative support for its military and yet not possess a totalitarian or even militaristic culture. Instead, the military are subordinate to the political offices and hence usually to the public's desire to pursue other programs. While the military may be praised and honoured for its service, it remains subservient to the rule of law and to accountable and open government. The properly construed liberal regime, one of the rule of law and the explicit subservience of the army as a functionary of the civil order, presents a key standard to which we can refer to review whether a government is moving into a militarised society, and hence militarism, or away from it. Consider further. The ideal government is one that is of the people, for the people, and by the people, one that serves the people rather than demands that the people serve it, and one that remains 100% responsible and accountable for its policies and their effects. Some may be smiling at such idealism, yet arguably this is what we have been straining to secure for the past 4 centuries, since the English Civil Wars, that produced an influential political ideology of freedoms, political thought that spread to France and its revolution, and then to America and its War of Independence, as well as to the principle of self-determination that was the rallying call for so many nationalities struggling under imperial dominance, and eventually also to the Declaration of Human Rights in the international organisations of the League of Nations and its successor body, the United Nations. Civility is underpinned by individualism, political plurality, and the ethos of peace between peoples, within countries and between them. Peaceful relations, not war and warfare, is deemed the essence of civilization, which is reflected in country and international recognition of the dignity of the individual, and of respective nations to pursue their own accountable ideals of civilization in the absence of external threats or internal repression. The use of the military under such an ideal is always a last resort. We may judge, and leave statisticians, economists, political scientists to produce the data, a government's leaning into militarism by its relative spending on the military, a government's cultural disposition to deploy the military when other means are possible still, or the language used by politicians and civil servants, and hence the emphasis that a country gives the military in political decision making. If we consider that political procedures and decisions take precedence over those of the military as the standard of a non-militaristic society, then we can be aware of the move away from that by governments turning to the military organisations for political decisions, or for leaning into deploying the military when domestic police forces should suffice, or even for control of the citizenry in some manner or form. We may find military people holding political positions, not as subservient advisors on military logistics and requirements given a political stance, but as insiders for the military proposing political goals, funnily enough, using the military. The old adage of various forms of ask a farrier, it'll be the shoe. That causes problems for the horse. Ask the saddler, it'll be the saddle. Ask the nutritionist, it'll be the horse's nutrition. So ask the military for an opinion. They are not likely to cast aside their professional training and seek the higher path to peace and wisdom, for example. In economics, when companies infiltrate government as lobbyists or indeed as tax-funded politicians, it is called regulatory capture. The infiltration is used to defend a company or industry from competition, or at best to advise government ministers on the effects of regulation. Though when such people switch positions in a revolving door, as it were, the government has become synonymous with the corporations, and the corporations with the government. This is very true with the banking sector, for example, since the central bankers, nominally independent, work closely with government because they fund government debt through inflation around the world. Now swap corporate and banking clans with the military, and the danger of militarism becomes apparent. It may begin with the military seeking increased funding by bending a government's ear to its agendas. Some may be connected to a particular industrial interest to invest in such and such a technology. Yet slowly, surely, in a mode in which the change is unchallenged, the military is given a more prominent place at the table. Not just behind the scenes, but in plain view, such as appearing with politicians as equals. The politicians begin deploying militaristic vocabulary and remind the government and public of threats, imminent, terroristic, extreme within and out with the country, or the need to respond to emergencies using the armed forces, often construed as national emergencies or exceptions to the prevailing expectations of civil and peaceful order. International emergencies may be another source of excusing military intervention in other countries, which effectively militarize a country's foreign relations under the guise of humanitarian assistance. Too often, such apparently noble offers of help are excuses for establishing military bases abroad, or for effecting political control over other sovereign states, and thereby militarizing what should be peaceful and respectful relations towards independent nations. Unsurprisingly, a tendency to deploy the military for a variety of purposes abroad may entangle the military in domestic roles that it is not constitutionally, politically or morally designed for. For instance, while we may accept the armed services' vigilance against potential external threats, a civilized country does not use it to guard over its civilians. That belongs to the police. And the path to militarism manifests when it is deployed for civilian services. In doing so, it is effectively militarizing those services. This may be considered a last and expedient resort if the normal civilian services fail, or on strike, for example, but consider this from the position of just war theory and the international legal understanding of legitimate targets to get a sense as to why this is dangerous. For example, a passenger ship is out of bounds as a military target, as long as it remains a passenger-carrying ship. It has a non-combatant and hence legal and moral inviolable status from the point of view of justifiable warfare. But as soon as a navy puts on board armed personnel and, say, anti-submarine or air defences, it has become militarised, and so too have all the passengers, knowingly or not. That is, a militarisation of an entity and group of people, regardless whether the non-combatants are aware or were asked consent for the military to operate on board, they now become a legitimate target. In an instance in the Battle of Arnhem in the Second World War, both Allied and German doctors would shoo away soldiers wanting to use a hospital as a fortress because they knew that it would militarise that hospital. If a civilian apartment block is used for air defences or for storing military personnel or materiel, it becomes militarised and hence a legitimate target, and so too with a society more broadly speaking. A town becomes a legitimate target if it is besieged. Now, the civilians should be permitted exit by the sieging forces, but after that the entire town is considered to be militarized and hence a legitimate target. A totalitarian regime that requires force to assert dominance in some or all aspects of civilian life effectively conquers a people as an enemy force would do. It also militarizes the state, and all civilians are therefore deemed legitimate targets. Totalitarian, militaristic states impose military order, military regulations, military tribunals, and military expectations of obedience, conformity, and discipline on a people. We can note that it differs from tyranny in that a tyrant rules on whim and is effectively a criminal running a country, whereas a militaristic society may produce barely varying expectations of conduct and order, but both, though, would deploy military force should the repressed civilians prefer to rise up in rebellion, such rebellions being described normally as terrorism, evoking national emergencies that imply brutal repressions and reprisals. And because the civilians have been militarized and conquered by the militarized state, they are assumed to be in a perpetual war with the armed forces, the enemy that is within, for example, and should be dealt with by force when needed. Are we currently on a militaristic path then? When the armed forces secure raised media profiles across news and social media channels, or when the internal police forces are armed like the military? What about when politicians begin wearing fatigues, or when serving military officers give press conferences or engage in social media campaigns of their own? Or what about when the military infiltrate, or their presence is encouraged in schools? Or when increasing proportions of civilians' taxes are channeled into the armed forces? When the military are used to police domestic incidents or enact surveillance on citizens' private lives? Or when civilians are subjected to experimental medicines, as the armed services often are? Or when the army distributes such medicines rather than the medical profession distributing them? Or what about when civilian reaction or questioning of policy is seen as insubordination? Or when opposing parties are deemed enemies of the state? When alternative voices in journalism are silenced through removal of licenses or imprisonment for trumped-up charges? When patriotism evolves into an aggressive flag-waving nationalism? When governments deploy fear, as if there were an invasion, regarding any political event to constrain public reaction and debate, and hence impose the need to be protected by force? Perhaps then we are being militarized. I shall leave it to viewers to make up their own minds and to add in their own thoughts and insights into the symptoms of militarization. Now, thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you like this video or at least got something out of it. I'm Dr. Alexander Mosley. Thank you.